A young nation founded on principles of liberty and equality, the United States faced a deep internal conflict in the mid-19th century. At the heart of this conflict was the institution of slavery. The southern states relied heavily on enslaved Africans for their agricultural economy, particularly for the production of cotton, often referred to as king cotton. The North, increasingly industrialized, viewed slavery as morally wrong and economically inefficient. This fundamental difference in views on slavery fueled growing tensions between the North and the South. Southerners argued for states' rights, believing that individual states should have the power to decide whether or not to allow slavery within their borders. They feared federal interference with their way of life and economic prosperity. The abolitionist movement in the North gained momentum, advocating for the complete abolishment of slavery. Abolitionists, through powerful speeches, writings, and even daring rescues of enslaved people, brought the issue of slavery to the forefront of national consciousness. The Underground Railroad, a network of secret routes and safe houses, helped countless enslaved individuals escape to freedom in the North. As the nation expanded westward, the question of whether slavery should be allowed in new territories became increasingly contentious. The debate over slavery dominated political discourse, pushing the nation closer to the brink of disunion. The year 1860 marked a pivotal moment in American history. The presidential election of that year would prove to be the spark that ignited the Civil War. The nation was deeply divided along sectional lines, with the issue of slavery serving as the primary point of contention. 4 candidates vied for the presidency, each representing different factions and viewpoints on the issue of slavery. Among them was Abraham Lincoln, a relatively unknown lawyer from Illinois, representing the newly formed Republican Party. The Republican Party, established on an anti-slavery platform, advocated for preventing the expansion of slavery into new territories. Lincoln's election, while not advocating for the immediate abolition of slavery, sent shockwaves throughout the South. Southern states viewed his victory as a direct threat to their way of life and their economic interests. They feared that Lincoln's administration would ultimately seek to abolish slavery altogether. In the aftermath of Lincoln's victory, the Southern states began to make good on their threats of secession. South Carolina led the way, seceding from the Union in December 1860. 6 other Southern states followed suit, forming the Confederate States of America. The nation was on the precipice of war. With the election of Abraham Lincoln, the fears of the Southern states reached a fever pitch. They believed that their rights and way of life were under direct threat. Secession, once considered a radical notion, now seemed like the only viable option to protect their interests. South Carolina, followed by Mississippi, Florida, Alabama, Georgia, Louisiana, and Texas, seceded from the Union. These 7 states, united by their dependence on enslaved labor and their belief in states' rights, formed the Confederate States of America in February 1861. They elected Jefferson Davis, a former U.S. Senator and Secretary of War, as their president. The Confederacy adopted a constitution that closely mirrored the U.S. Constitution, but with key differences. The Confederate Constitution explicitly protected the institution of slavery and emphasized the sovereignty of individual states. They argued that they had the legal right to secede, framing it as an act of self-preservation against Northern aggression. The newly formed Confederacy quickly moved to assert its independence. They seized federal forts and arsenals within their borders, preparing for the looming conflict. The stage was set for a showdown that would determine the fate of the nation. The first shots fired. Fort Sumter and the beginning of war. Tensions reached a boiling point in April 1861 at Fort Sumter, a federal outpost located in Charleston Harbor, South Carolina. The fort, manned by a small contingent of Union soldiers, became a symbol of federal authority in the newly declared Confederacy. Confederate forces, under the command of General P.G.T. Beauregard, demanded the surrender of Fort Sumter. The Union commander, Major Robert Anderson, refused to yield. On April 12, 1861, Confederate artillery opened fire on Fort Sumter, marking the beginning of the American Civil War. The bombardment of Fort Sumter sent shockwaves throughout the nation. The war that many had hoped to avoid had become a reality. Lincoln called for 75,000 volunteers to suppress the rebellion, and 4 more southern states, Virginia, Arkansas, Tennessee, and North Carolina, joined the Confederacy. The nation was now divided, with brother fighting against brother in a bloody conflict that would claim the lives of over 620,000 soldiers. The Civil War, the deadliest war in American history, had begun. Clash of Titans. Key battles of the Civil War. The American Civil War was marked by numerous battles, each with its own significance in shaping the course of the conflict. 2 battles in particular stand out as turning points: the Battle of Gettysburg and the Siege of Vicksburg. The Battle of Gettysburg, fought in July 1863, was a pivotal victory for the Union Army. Confederate General Robert E. Lee's attempt to invade the North was decisively repulsed by Union forces under General George G. Meade. The 3-day battle, which resulted in heavy casualties on both sides, marked a turning point in the war, halting the Confederacy's momentum. The Siege of Vicksburg, also in July 1863, was another significant victory for the Union. Vicksburg, Mississippi, a strategically important city on the Mississippi River, had been under Confederate control. Union General Ulysses S. Grant's successful siege and capture of Vicksburg gave the Union control of the Mississippi River, effectively splitting the Confederacy in 2. These victories, along with others, turned the tide of the war in favor of the Union. The Confederacy, facing dwindling resources and manpower, fought on with determination but ultimately could not withstand the North's industrial might and manpower. At the beginning of 1864, Lincoln made Grant commander of all Union armies. Grant made his headquarters with the Army of the Potomac and put Major General William Tecumseh Sherman in command of most of the Western armies. Grant understood the concept of total war and believed, along with Lincoln and Sherman, that only the utter defeat of Confederate forces and their economic base would end the war. This was total war not in killing civilians, but in taking provisions and forage and destroying homes, farms, and railroads that Grant said would otherwise have gone to the support of secession and rebellion. This policy, I believe, exercised a material influence in hastening the end. Grant devised a coordinated strategy that would strike at the entire Confederacy from multiple directions. Generals Meade and Benjamin Butler were ordered to move against Lee near Richmond. General Franz Sigel was to attack the Shenandoah Valley. General Sherman was to capture Atlanta and march to the Atlantic Ocean. Generals George Crook and William W. Averill were to operate against railroad supply lines in West Virginia, and Major General Nathaniel P. Banks was to capture Mobile, Alabama. Grant's army set out on the overland campaign, intending to draw Lee into a defense of Richmond, where they would attempt to pin down and destroy the Confederate Army. The Union Army first attempted to maneuver past Lee and fought several battles, notably at the Wilderness, Spotsylvania, and Cold Harbor. These resulted in heavy losses on both sides and forced Lee's Confederates to fall back repeatedly. At the Battle of Yellow Tavern, the Confederates lost Jeb Stuart. An attempt to outflank Lee from the south failed under Butler, who was trapped inside the Bermuda Hundred River bend. Each battle resulted in setbacks for the Union that mirrored those they had suffered under prior generals. Though unlike them, Grant chose to fight on rather than retreat. Grant was tenacious and kept pressing Lee's Army of Northern Virginia back to Richmond. While Lee was preparing for an attack on Richmond, Grant unexpectedly turned south to cross the James River and began the protracted siege of Petersburg, where the 2 armies engaged in trench warfare for over 9 months. Grant finally found a commander, General Philip Sheridan, aggressive enough to prevail in the Valley campaigns of 1864. Sheridan was repelled at the Battle of New Market Confederate General John C. Breckinridge. The Battle of New Market was the Confederacy's last major victory and included a charge by teenage VMI cadets. After redoubling his efforts, Sheridan defeated Major General Jubal A. early in a series of battles, including a decisive defeat at the Battle of Cedar Creek. Sheridan then proceeded to destroy the agricultural base of the Shenandoah Valley, a strategy similar to the tactics Sherman later employed in Georgia. Meanwhile, Sherman maneuvered from Chattanooga to Atlanta, defeating Confederate Generals Joseph E. Johnston and John Bell Hood. The fall of Atlanta on September 2, 1864, guaranteed the re-election of Lincoln. Hood left the Atlanta area to swing around and menace Sherman's supply lines and invade Tennessee in the Franklin-Nashville campaign. Union Major General John Schofield defeated Hood at the Battle of Franklin, and George H. Thomas dealt Hood a massive defeat at the Battle of Nashville, effectively destroying Hood's army. Leaving Atlanta and his base of supplies, Sherman's army marched, with no destination set, laying waste to about 20% of the farms in Georgia in his march to the sea. He reached the Atlantic at Savannah, Georgia in December 1864. Sherman's army was followed by thousands of freed slaves. There were no major battles along the march. Sherman turned north through South Carolina and North Carolina to approach the Confederate Virginia lines from the south, increasing the pressure on Lee's army. Lee's army, thinned by desertion and casualties, was now much smaller than Grant's. One last Confederate attempt to break the Union hold on Petersburg failed at the decisive Battle of Five Forks on April 1st. The Union now controlled the entire perimeter surrounding Richmond-Petersburg, completely cutting it off from the Confederacy. Realizing the capital was now lost, Lee's army and the Confederate government were forced to evacuate. The Confederate capital fell on April 2nd-3rd to the Union Wafifiv Corps, composed of black troops. The remaining Confederate units fled west after a defeat at Sailor's Creek on April 6th. End of the war. This New York Times front page celebrated Lee's surrender, headlining how Grant let Confederate officers retain their sidearms and paroled the Confederate officers and men. News of Lee's April 9th surrender reached this southern newspaper, Savannah, Georgia, on April 15th, after the April 14th shooting of President Lincoln. The article quotes Grant's terms of surrender. Lee did not intend to surrender, but planned to regroup at Appomattox Station, where supplies were to be waiting, and then continue the war. Grant chased Lee and got in front of him, so that when Lee's army reached the village of Appomattox Courthouse, they were surrounded. After an initial battle, Lee decided the fight was hopeless and surrendered his Army of Northern Virginia to Grant on April 9, 1865, during a conference at the McLean House. In an untraditional gesture and as a sign of Grant's respect and anticipation of peacefully restoring Confederate states to the Union, Lee was permitted to keep his sword and horse, Traveler. His men were paroled, and a chain of Confederate surrenders began. 100. On April 14, 1865, Lincoln was shot by John Wilkes Booth, a Confederate sympathizer. Lincoln died early the next morning. Lincoln's vice president, Andrew Johnson, was unharmed because his would-be assassin, George Atzerodt, lost his nerve, so Johnson was immediately sworn in as president. Meanwhile, Confederate forces across the South surrendered, as news of Lee's surrender reached them. On April 26th, the same day Sergeant Boston Corbett killed Booth at a tobacco barn, Johnston surrendered nearly 90,000 troops of the Army of Tennessee to Sherman at Bennett Place, near present-day Durham, North Carolina. It proved to be the largest surrender of Confederate forces. On May 4th, all remaining Confederate forces in Alabama, Mississippi, and Louisiana east of the Mississippi, under the command of Lieutenant General Richard Taylor, surrendered. 1. Confederate President Davis was captured in retreat at Irwinville, Georgia on May 10th. The final land battle was fought on May 13, 1865, at the Battle of Palmito Ranch in Texas. On May 26, 1865, Confederate Lieutenant General Simon B. Buckner, acting for Edmund Smith, signed a military convention surrendering Confederate forces in the Trans-Mississippi Department. This date is often cited by contemporaries and historians as the effective end date of the war. On June 2nd, with most of his troops having already gone home, a reluctant Kirby Smith had little choice but to sign the official surrender document. On June 23rd, Cherokee leader and Brig General Stand Watie became the last Confederate general to surrender his forces. On June 19, 1865, Union Major General Gordon Granger announced General Order No. 3, bringing the Emancipation Proclamation into effect in Texas and freeing the last slaves of the Confederacy. The anniversary of this date is now celebrated as Juneteenth. The naval part of the war ended more slowly. It had begun on April 11th, 2 days after Lee's surrender, when Lincoln proclaimed that foreign nations had no further claim or pretense to deny equality of maritime rights and hospitalities to U.S. warships, and, in effect, that rights extended to Confederate ships to use neutral ports as safe havens from U.S. warships should end. Having no response to Lincoln's proclamation, President Johnson issued a similar proclamation dated May 10th, more directly stating that the war was almost at an end and insurgent cruisers still at sea and prepared to attack U.S. ships should not have rights to do so through use of safe foreign ports or waters. Britain finally responded on June 6th by transmitting a letter from Foreign Secretary John Russell, 1st Earl Russell, to the Lords of the Admiralty withdrawing rights to Confederate warships to enter British ports and waters. U.S. Secretary of State Seward welcomed the withdrawal of concessions to the Confederates. Finally, on October 18th, Russell advised the Admiralty that the time specified in his June message had elapsed and all measures of a restrictive nature on vessels of war of the United States in British ports, harbors, and waters are now to be considered as at an end. Nonetheless, the final Confederate surrender was in Liverpool, England, where James Iredell Waddell, the captain of CSS Shenandoah, surrendered the cruiser to British authorities on November 6th. On September 22, 1862, Lincoln issued a preliminary Emancipation Proclamation. On April 14, 1865, Lincoln was shot by John Wilkes Booth, a Confederate sympathizer. Abraham Lincoln died early the next morning,